Now in our 25th year, a quarter of a century of service to the worldwide amateur radio community, we are This Week in Amateur Radio, your all-amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. This is edition number 1340 with a release and air date of Saturday, November 2nd, 2024. Please take the program to your air following the cue tone.
On the air around the world on the amateur bands, and streaming on the internet since 1993, serving the amateur radio community with weekly, reliable, amateur radio news and special features, we are This Week in Amateur Radio, the worldwide premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Here are the stories for release around the earth, as we come to air with edition number 1340, of This Week in Amateur Radio. The ARRL recognizes the University of Scranton during its state-of-the-art amateur radio station dedication. The planned changes to amateur radio licenses in the UK are delayed by Ofcom. The ARRL releases its latest update on VEC services and more in its latest response to online system disruptions. The Dream Rig contest for young amateurs is now underway. A noted shortwave broadcaster in Austria is facing an end-of-year shutdown. An Intelsat satellite explodes while in active geostationary orbit. The recent ARRL online auction raises $47,000 for amateur radio STEM education and more. The director of the HAM SCI program receives a $1.8 million grant. A balloon carrying amateur radio is finally heard from flying over Antarctica. We will have news from AMSAT, and a new space startup called Reflect Orbital is on its way to selling sunlight at night, using large mirrors in space. We will tell you all about it in this week's report. These headline stories will come to you in a moment, along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all those amateur satellites in orbit. Australia's own Ono Benshop, VK6FLAB, and Foundations of Amateur Radio will tell us all about the venerable QSL Bureau. Our own amateur radio historian, Will Rogers, K5WLR, and a century of amateur radio, will take us aboard the Wayback Machine to take us back to the very early days of amateur radio to witness the federal government shut down amateur radio. With ham radio shut down completely by the war, amateurs were not just off the air, but leaving home for military service. This week's edition is entitled, Shut Down and Called Up. We will stop by and visit with Bill Saliers, AJ8B in the DX Corner, with all the latest news on DXpeditions, DX, upcoming radio sport contests and more. That's all straight ahead, as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air, right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio just outside Albany, New York, where our temperatures feel like early fall, this is W2XBS.
And reporting this week from our news bureau in Cortlandville, New York, I'm Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
And reporting from our news bureau in Salem, Ohio, this is Denny Haight, NZ8D.
And reporting from our bureau in Dallas, Texas, where the trees are still green, but we're finally getting a little fall weather, I'm Tammy, KI5ODE.
And reporting from our news bureau in Rochester, New York, I'm Dave Wilson, WA2HOY.
And reporting from our news bureau just outside Albany, New York, in the Geek Cave studios, I'm Rich Lawrence, KB2MOB.
And reporting from a seasonably warm Troy, New York news bureau, I'm Eric, KD2RJX.
And reporting from our news bureau in Knoxville, Tennessee, where I got out and early voted this week, I'm Josh Marler, AA4WX.
And reporting from our Catskill Mountains radio outpost in the western part of New York State, where Indian summer continues unabated for another straight week, I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And reporting from our news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where autumn has finally arrived with a bang, a tornado-worn cell passing a mile or so west of my location, a bit too close for comfort. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, grateful I'm still here.
And now, with this week's lead story, here's our own Chris Perrine, KB2 FAF.
Leading off our news this week, the University of Scranton in Pennsylvania has a new amateur radio station, W3USR. To tell us more about the station dedication at the university, we go to John Ross, KD8IDJ, who files this special report from League headquarters.
The dedication was held at the university's Loyola Science Center on Friday, October 25, 2024, led by Dr. Nathaniel Frizzell, W2NAF, an associate professor of physics and electrical engineering and club advisor for the University of Scranton Amateur Radio Club. The new W3USR University of Scranton Amateur Radio Station supports the radio club, academic research, and the university's outreach to the community. Frizzell kicked off the dedication by framing the station's purpose for education, research, service, and fun. With the establishment of your radio club and station, you're not just creating a technical resource, you're building a vibrant community of learners and innovators, said Bob Inderbitson, NQ1R, the Director of Marketing and Innovation for ARRL. Inderbitson, by the way, is also a staff advisor for the ARRL Collegiate Amateur Radio Program. Club President Gerald Piccini, KD2ZHK, ceremoniously handed an application for an ARRL affiliation to Inderbitson, who responded by presenting the University of Scranton Amateur Radio Club as the newest ARRL-affiliated club. Since its inception in 1918, the affiliated club program has united amateur radio clubs to enhance the amateur radio service, recognizing their crucial role in developing active radio operators and serving local communities. You are now part of a thriving network of college ham stations across the country, each contributing to a larger tapestry of knowledge, innovation, and fun, said Inderbitson. Before the dedication, students provided tours of W3USR. Perched 5 stories up, the room committed to the news station is impressive for being well appointed with the latest amateur radio gear, but also for its panoramic views of the campus and the city of Scranton. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
The station is equipped for HF, VHF, and UHF, and has capabilities for voice, CW, and digital modes, and for operating via the amateur satellites. Among the student tour guides were undergraduate student Piccini, Thomas Pisano, KE2BAC, the club's vice president, Alexandros Papadopoulos, KC3WUD, Secretary James Fox, KE2ANL, Treasurer Owen Ruzensky, who's a freshman and a new club member. Guests were also guided to the roof of the Science Center for a closer look at the antennas, described by Jeff DiPolo, WN3A. DiPolo is the owner of Broadcast Sciences, LLC, which was responsible for designing and installing the station. A centerpiece of the antenna farm is a 40-foot tower with a DX Engineering Skyhawk tri-band Yagi for 20, 15, and 10 meters. One of the goals was to be able to install a tower without having to do any roof penetrations or anything structural as far as the roof goes, said DiPolo. A 200-foot crane was used to set the tower and antennas into place. The tower is attached to 10 12x12 steel tubes with 5/8-inch walls that are tied into the steel structure of the roof. The tower also includes an antenna for the W3 USR 70-centimeter repeater and a fan dipole for 40 and 80 meters. Additional antennas are installed on mounts across the roof. Most of the more than $200,000 of funding for the new station came from a generous grant from Amateur Radio Digital Communications, which has awarded many grants and scholarships supporting amateur radio and students pursuing higher education. Additional donations and support were made by Dr. Mary Lou West, KC2NMC, Ed Hayes, N6XEM, and also Jeff DiPolo, WN3A, DX Engineering, and the National Science Foundation. The dedication ceremony included remarks from ARDC Executive Director Rosie Schechter, KJ7RYV, National Science Foundation Aeronomy Program Director Dr. Shika Razada, WP4PYE, the University of Scranton President Father Joseph Marina, and Interim Provost Dr. Tracy Stewart. The ceremony concluded with a presentation of one of the many research projects pairing students with radio amateurs and scientists. Papadopoulos described programming techniques he and Pacini had learned in a DSP course, which they used to automate the analysis of an HF time difference of arrival experiment conducted by Steve Serwin, WA5 FRF. Serwin is a retired Institute scientist at Southwest Research Institute, where he designed custom electronic instrumentation and antenna systems. The experiment sought to identify multipath propagation modes between two HF stations by transmitting an audio chirp using conventional amateur radios and measuring the height of the F2 region of the ionosphere by sensing and analyzing the time distance of arrival. The University of Scranton Radio Club was established in 2020. Throughout its short tenure, the club has generated the attention of the wider community of university amateur radio clubs for its success in developing student experiences with radio communications and wireless technology.
Now celebrating our 25th year keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
Hams in the UK who have been expecting additional changes in the license system before the end of this year are going to have to wait a bit longer for them to take effect, according to regulator Ofcom. A recent announcement by Ofcom said that phases 2 and 3 of the licensing platform modifications were being delayed instead of going forward later this year and in early 2025. The planned changes include limits being set on the number of call signs an individual amateur can hold, in this case only one personal license per individual. This will require hams who advance to the next license class to surrender their previous license. Ofcom had hoped to introduce the M8 and M9 call signs for those passing the intermediate license exam to replace the 2 series, and as an optional change for intermediate license holders currently holding 2E0 and 2E1 call signs. It is expected that at some unknown point, however, Ofcom will take back all numeral 2 call sign prefixes. Also, when these changes take effect, hams will be permitted to change their call sign, but not more than once every 5 years. The delay also affects changes to the application process for special events, which Ofcom has said will become simpler, fully automated, and quicker. Ofcom did not give a date for when these changes would go forward.
ARRL previously reported that we are responding to a serious incident involving access to our network and headquarters-based systems. Here's the latest update. Several services have been affected, including those administered by the ARRL Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. The ARRL volunteer examiners should continue to submit exam registrations and material requests. We are able to post new or revised exam session dates and details to the website, and we continue to ship out exam materials. Please remember that most exam materials are available on our website. We are processing amateur radio license applications to the FCC. This includes applications for new and upgrade licenses, including applications and club license applications. The VEC exam session upload page was not affected by the incident. The VE session counts web page data entry programming had been unavailable since May 12th. That part of the program system became operational again in mid-October. However, there is a 5 to 6 month backlog of session and VE participation data to enter into the system. It will take some time for the session counts page to reflect the data correctly, but will be updated as quickly as we are able. We thank you in advance for your patience and understanding as we work our way through the backlog. As of mid-October, we are able to create volunteer examiner badges, certificates, and stickers. The new ARRL VE applications and accreditation renewals are also being processed at this time. International amateur radio permits and license class certificates are being created and shipped. The Volunteer Examiner Newsletter email program has been unavailable since the security incident in May. New subscribers cannot be added, and existing information cannot be updated. Please check back in with us when we have access to that program system. A previous version of this story indicated that the ARRL VEC will supply its officially appointed field stock VE team leaders with the new extra class exam booklet designs around mid-June. Due to ARRL's recent system disruption, the shipment was delayed. The exam booklets were shipped out July 8th and should have been delivered before August 1st. VE teams may contact the ARRL VEC to receive instructions on how to print new extra exams in the interim. The newly revised pool must be used for extra class license exams starting July 1st, 2024. Exam designs based on the previous pool are no longer valid. The outdated versions of the extra exams should be destroyed or thrown away to avoid mix-up at the testing session. ARRL is continuing to accept reimbursement forms to cover the one-time $35 application fee for new license candidates younger than 18 years of age for tests administered under the auspices of the ARRL VEC. Reimbursement checks may take longer than normal to be processed at this time. We appreciate your patience as ARRL continues to work on restoring access to affected systems and services.
It is time for the Volunteer Monitor Program report. As always, the Volunteer Monitor Program is a joint initiative between ARRL and the FCC to enhance compliance in the amateur radio service. This is the monthly activity report of the VM program. Technician class licensees in Indiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi received advisory notices regarding FT8 operation on 40 meters. Technicians have only CW privileges on 40 meters. Licensees in Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Michigan, and New Jersey received advisory notices for excessively wide signals of 10 kHz or more. Commission Rule Part 97.307 Subpart A provides that no amateur shall occupy more bandwidth than necessary for the information rate and emission type being transmitted in accordance with good amateur practice. A licensee in Florida received an advisory notice for deliberate interference to a DX station and to operators trying to work the DX station on 14.252 MHz. Such operation is in violation of Section 97.101 Subpart B of Commission Rules. The operator was cautioned that FCC fines for such operation normally start at $7,000. There was one general volunteer monitor alert. There were 2 FCC referrals regarding apparent experimental high-speed stock trading signals on amateur frequencies. The program administrator presented a program by video conference to the Wisconsin DX Club and participated in one FCC meeting. The totals for monitoring in this report were 1,475 hours on HF frequencies and 2,455 hours on VHF frequencies and above, for a total of 3,930. We thank Volunteer Monitor Program Administrator Riley Hollingsworth, K for ZDH, for this report.
After weeks of speculation, Austria's ORS shortwave radio station confirmed that its shutdown date will be December 31st. The news came to the German National Ham Radio Society's weekly Radio DARC program on October 14th. The station recently lost its major broadcast client, Adventist World Radio, which will end its transmissions this month. That leaves only a handful of customers for the ORS station, including Radio DARC, for whom it carried a special worldwide broadcast of the World Radio Sport Team Championship in 2018. The shortwave site was formerly the Radio Austria International broadcast station and is well known for having had Europe's largest directional antenna system for shortwave broadcasts. Various news reports, including those from Radio DARC in Germany and the British DX Club, had said that the Moosbrunn site was likely to be shut down by the 31st of December. ORS is among the few remaining shortwave broadcasters in Europe and has provided programming for listeners in the Near East, the Middle East, and Africa.
An Intelsat communications satellite built by Boeing has exploded and broken up in geostationary orbit. Intelsat confirmed the news in a press release on October 21, declaring the satellite a total loss. U.S. Space Force said it's tracking around 20 associated pieces, but has observed no immediate threats to other satellites so far. Roscosmos said it was tracking 80 fragments. The cause of the explosion is not yet known, but the news is another blow to Boeing following Starliner's failed crew test flight, problems with the 737 MAX, and delays to the 777X. Intelsat said it's working to move customers to its other satellites or third-party spacecraft. A failure review board has convened to complete a comprehensive analysis of the cause, the company wrote. The satellite was uninsured, a spokesman told Space News. The explosion fragments could still pose a risk to other satellites. The problem is that there's a lot of uncertainty regarding the orbits of these fragments at the moment, said a spokesperson for Spaceflux, a UK company that tracks objects in orbit. They can be potentially dangerous for other satellites, but we don't just know yet. Intelsat 33E is one of 6 Epic NG satellites built by Boeing and uses the latter's 720MP satellite platform equipped with 16 hydrazine-powered engines built by Aerojet Rocketdyne. The type is widely used for telephone, internet, and satellite TV and radio broadcast service. It entered service 3 months late due to an issue with its primary thruster, and another propulsion issue reduced its service life by 3.5 years. The first Epic NG satellite, Intelsat 29E, was declared a total loss in 2019 after just 3 years of service, reportedly due to a meteoroid impact or wiring flaw.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
The 19th annual ARRL online auction, sponsored by RT Systems Incorporated, went off without a hitch from October 18th through the 24th, 2024. In addition to hundreds of views, the auction saw 329 individual bidders vying for equipment, vintage books, mystery junk boxes from the ARRL lab, and more. There were 206 items up for bid, and more than 1,430 bids were recorded, with 40 items finishing in overtime bidding. This year's ARRL online auction grossed more than $47,000. Top 3 items with the most bids were, both with 25 bids each, Mastrant Rope and ARRL Field Day Cooler Bag Surprise, and with 24 bids was one of the mystery junk boxes. Proceeds from the yearly ARRL online auction go directly to ARRL's educational programs, including promoting activities to license new hams, strengthening amateur radio's emergency service training, offering continuing technical and operating education, and creating instructional materials. The ARRL Teachers Institute on Wireless Technology trains educators to incorporate amateur radio and wireless communications into their science, technology, engineering, and mathematics lessons. This is creating a real impact on the number of new hams across the country.
Nathaniel Frizzle, Ph.D., W2NAF, Associate Professor of Physics and Engineering at the University of Scranton, has been awarded a grant of $1.8 million by the National Science Foundation to further the efforts of AMSAT, a network of ham radio operators helping to measure weather effects among the Earth's ionosphere. According to Dr. Frizzle, the grants support the development of a network of 30 standardized receive stations capable of observing high-frequency Doppler shifts, HF Amateur Radio Weak Signal Propagation Reporter, or WHISPER, transmissions, very low-frequency transmissions, and natural radio emissions, and the geomagnetic field. The grant will also fund 10 WHISPER SON transmitters to serve as a source of GPS-stabilized HF beacon signals and will tie into the existing WHISPER network. AMSAT has recently organized the 2023 and 2024 Solar Eclipse QSO Party, allowing hams to contribute to scientific studies aimed at understanding how the ionosphere reacts to solar eclipses. Meanwhile, a Massachusetts ham and a North Dakota Amateur Radio Club have been declared top scorers for their participation in AMSAT's Solar Eclipse QSO Party this past April. Congratulations to Dennis Egan, W1UE, who claimed the highest score in the category of single op during AMSAT's Solar Eclipse QSO Party. He shares the glory with the Saris Valley Amateur Radio Club, K0AJW in North Dakota, which claimed the number 1 spot in the multi-op category. HAMSAI, the Citizen Science Investigation Organization, made the announcement on its website on the 24th of October and thanked all radio amateurs who got on the air. Those QSOs helped generate data for space physics research about the eclipse's impact on the HF radio spectrum, and, of course, that makes science itself the biggest winner.
The Biden administration on October 17th eased export restrictions on U.S. commercial space companies to ship certain satellite and spacecraft-related items to allies and partners. The changes are intended to make it easier for the growing U.S. commercial space industry to expand sales while also protecting national security and foreign policy interests. Certain items involving remote sensing spacecraft or space-based logistics assembly and servicing spacecraft will no longer need licenses for shipment to Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom, the Commerce Department said in the statement. Some less sensitive satellite and spacecraft parts and components will no longer require licenses for shipment to over 40 countries. The countries include Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and most of the European Union, a person familiar with the matter said. In addition, the Commerce Department will do away with license requirements for the least sensitive items like electrical connectors for most of the world, but not countries of concern like Russia and China, the person said. A proposed rule was also published regarding the transfer of jurisdiction of certain space-related defense articles from the State Department to the Commerce Department, making it easier to export them to close allies and partners. The rules come after a proposed rulemaking nearly 5 years ago and a December 2023 National Space Council request.
Many months after it's marked its first anniversary of orbiting the Earth, the WB-6 RER Pico balloon was spotted over Antarctica. Germany's Antarctic station, Nummer 3, DP0 GVN/1, provided the good news following a period of concern when the balloon appeared to have gone silent for 5 months. The October 15th spot by the Antarctic Scientific Research Station showed that the balloon was flying at an altitude of 45,735 feet, with its solar panel measuring 3.88 volts. Weighing 11 grams, the hydrogen gas-filled balloon was launched in May of 2023 from Golden Valley, Arizona, by the Wallapie Amateur Radio Club. One of the greatest challenges during its year in orbit has been to overcome damage to its 20-meter dipole antenna.
The 5th Annual Youth Dream Rig Essay Contest has begun to accept submissions. John Ross, KD8IDJ, has all the details.
The contest is sponsored by the Intrepid DX Group, a U.S.-based 501c3 nonprofit organization that promotes amateur radio activities around the world and recognizes the importance of including youth in the amateur radio hobby. Contestants must be a USA citizen or Canadian amateur radio license holders aged 19 or younger. All contestants must be in the U.S., including territories or Canada. And they must write a 2-page essay answering the following question. What do you see as ham radio's place in society? How can it benefit our society and at the same time become attractive to others your age? The essay in plain text, PDF, or MS Word attachment should be sent to the Intrepid DX Group at gmail.com, or you can mail it to the Intrepid DX Group, 3052 Wetmore Drive, San Jose, California, 95148. Entries must be postmarked, though, by November 30th, 2024. Those who have previously submitted an essay may still compete in this year's contest, as long as all of the other requirements are met. The first place prize is an ICOM IC 7300 transceiver. Second place prize is an ICOM ID5 5100 AD dual band mobile radio with D-Star. And the third place prize is an ICOM IC 10D dual band handheld. All entrants and winners must promise to keep the radios for 1 year without flipping, trading, or selling them, and to use the radios on the air. The winners of the essay contest will be announced on the Intrepid DX Group's website and Facebook page on December 15th, 2024, and they must agree to provide a photo along with their prize. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
All submissions become property of the Intrepid DX Group, and the winners authorize Intrepid DX Group to use their photographs to promote the contests. For additional questions or information, email intrepiddxgroup@gmail.com.
The International Amateur Radio Union celebrates its centenary in 2025. Since its founding in France, the IARU has worked tirelessly to promote innovation in amateur radio and to encourage the growth of the service in communities throughout the world. The IARU has represented the amateur services at international and regional regulatory bodies by relying on volunteers who come from many countries and communities. The IARU has been a sector member of the International Telecommunications Union since 1932, and the work of volunteers has continued since that date, with unmatched success as was highlighted with accomplishments at World Radio Conference 2023. Leading up to the IARU centenary year, we should take time to reflect on the remarkable achievements of radio amateurs over the last 100 years. While the amateur services have been in operation for over a century, 1924 was the first year that transcontinental amateur communication became more or less commonplace. Since that time, radio amateurs have made unparalleled advances in technology related to the amateur services that play a critical role today in sustaining worldwide communications and allow us to respond to global emergencies. Another IARU special call operating is HS-19 IARU, active between October 12th and November 10th for the 19th IARU Region 3 Conference, hosted in Bangkok by the Radio Amateur Society of Thailand on November 4th through the 8th.
Coming up next, This Week in Amateur Radio is presenting another chapter of A Century of Amateur Radio, Hams, Organizations, Events, Inventions, from the mind of Chris Cordella, W2PA, and his editing team. Each episode will bring a different aspect of early amateur radio history. Coming up right after station identification here on This Week in Amateur Radio.
You are listening to North America's premier news and information service for the amateur radio hobbyist. We are This Week in Amateur Radio.
Welcome to the 19th segment of Ham Radio History, A Century of Amateur Radio, Ham's Organizations, Events, Inventions. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR. I am sending many thanks to Chris Cordella, W2PA, for permitting us to use his website in the preparation of these programs. Now here comes the next chapter of Ham Radio History. Shut down and called up. With ham radio shut down completely by the war, the old man was back the following month with an article titled simply Rotten, which is what he thought of the closing of amateur stations, finding that he no longer had anything to do in the evenings. What was the harm, he asked, in allowing us to at least listen? One compensation for him had been an increase in the activity meetings of the local radio club. Despite the good humor at the league, the membership was not just off the air, but leaving home for military service. QST was the only remaining medium keeping amateurs in touch, and league officials were beginning to realize that it would not last without an influx of new members and subscribers. Being of prime age for service, Tuska noted that he, too, would soon have to either join the Naval Reserve, the radio service, or be drafted. So, along with an appeal for subscriptions and renewals, the editorial page called for someone with a more or less defective anatomy to please help continue to put out QST. Endorsing this appeal, a letter from none other than Thomas Edison was printed on the inside front cover, complimenting the ARRL on the magazine, having judged the issue sent to him by Tuska to be very interesting. In July, the ARRL announced a drive to sign up 2,000 operators for military service. Hams could serve their country while receiving an education in their favorite pursuit. Harvard University turned Pierce Hall over to the Navy for training and housing radio electricians. Courses including 30 words per minute code, theory and apparatus, and secret code work were taught. Training would require a small amount of drill work, too, since a radio operator is a petty officer and must know how to handle men. A second, somewhat smaller school at the Brooklyn Navy Yard and a third at Maury Island, San Francisco, were also established. A month later, the 3-page lead article, What the Naval Reserve Offers Men of the ARRL, subtitled as written specially for QST by the Naval Publicity Bureau, announced another training facility at Columbia University. The Navy offered a long list of interesting subjects to be covered in its training, such as transmitting and receiving sets, condensers and oscillating circuits, and electromagnetism. All of that, and they'd pay you too. At the top end of the 5-grade scale, chief electricians would receive $72 per month, and at the bottom, electricians, radio, landsmen, $32.50 per month. You would also get subsistence and retainer fees. Interested amateurs were to clip the enrollment form printed in QST, take it to the recruiting office, get a physical, and then send it to the ARRL for handling. If you didn't like the idea of cutting up your QST, the League would send you a separate blank on request. 100 enlisted men per year could also take tests to be selected for admission to the Naval Academy. You just had to have passed your 17th birthday. Members began to report with stories about their military service, being careful to include only as much detail as necessary and allowed. Many ARRL trunk line operators had by then joined up and were listed in QST, some along with their assigned locations. Even Mrs. Candler, 8NH, had enlisted in the reserve. An anonymous contributor, identified only as P, wrote of his experience as Navy receiver operator. Everything from procedures to Q signals had changed from what was familiar to him. Practically everything is in code, he reported. I have sometimes listened for 3 hours without hearing anything to disturb the absolute silence of the ether. Just think what a blessing this would have been in normal times. Stories of station closing activities around the country also filled the news. The Baltimore Radio Association reported how amateur stations had been closed and sealed across the area with the help of the club, in part to show a public face of cooperation by organized amateurs. So-called sealing parties had closed more than 235 stations thus far, some even in the absence of their owners. All were accomplished without opposition, and some reporting humorous incidents at the club meetings, either to report on the unevenness of government closings in other cities or to boast about their own accomplishments. The club claimed that no such operation had occurred in neighboring cities, for example, Washington, where no closings had yet happened, and Philadelphia, where some stations were still reportedly operating. Except for the relay committee, the club planned to continue to function during the shutdown, and regular meetings would continue. They suggested that QST begin an experimental department where new technical ideas could be published and discussed. Some members had always been more interested in the technology than in relaying anyway, they claimed. In Buffalo, New York, the county sheriff and deputies, along with local police, were assigned by the governor to detect and dismantle amateur stations. Over 300 had been closed by mid-April. The city also set up a station in the federal building to detect and help locate any stations still in operation. Evidently, there was a procedure for municipal authorities to obtain permission to do so, since it was set up by the city's radio engineer. After being taken over by the Navy, the local commercial station reopened for commercial use under their censorship. A central figure in the city was MB West 8AEZ, one of the ARRL trunk line organizers. Referred to as Radio Gunner West and the radio censor for the United States government for this district, West had also been actively recruiting for the Navy in the local area. Professionally involved in radio from its early beginnings, he had then lost interest altogether because of the crude equipment available at the time, but was reintroduced to it in 1914 by a group of boys who came to him for advice on setting up an amateur station. Building a station and hearing the air filled with signals, he found himself hooked this time. As midsummer set in, QST, having hit a peak of 100 pages in April, was now down to 44 in the August issue. Yet its optimistic tone remained, and the full page opposite the table of contents claimed that following the initial wave of discouragement at the closing, the tide had now turned. Amateurs continued to report their wartime experiences. Bill Woods, 9HS, operated from Manistique, Michigan at WMX, another commercial station taken over by the Navy. In his letter, which included a redacted word or two, he described his midnight to 6 a.m. shift, listening to the goings-on with no QRM at all. When he and other amateurs reported to the Great Lakes Naval Training Station, NAJ, they initially were discouraged to find that few there seemed to even know what radio was, but over time they discovered a few others with similar backgrounds and prepared to have a regular hamfest with radio amateurs. This may have been the first use of the term hamfest in QST. Regular NHA confabs took place among old amateur radio friends, the radio bugs, including well-known trunkline operators such as 9ABD, wrote James Crotus, 9HN. They would often gather after work and talk well into the evening until the bugler blew taps. Some of the most enjoyed moments of his life were spent at this training camp. A group of them answering a call for volunteers for Class II sea duty headed for Cambridge, Massachusetts, and the Naval Radio Reserve School. There they met many more operators who had come in from all districts of the country. Our Pacific Coast friends are doing their bit, Walter Maines reported from the Naval Radio Station San Francisco. They nightly copied KHK, a 5 kW 600-meter spark station in Waihawa, territory of Hawaii, designated TH then, nearly 2,100 miles away in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and the Sea of Summer Static. About twice weekly, they also copied JOC on 600-meter spark from Japan, 5,475 miles distant, along with ships off the Japanese coast. Daytime receptions were limited to 500 to 750 miles. Their station, yet another private one taken over by the government for receiving work only, was equipped with 2 oscillating Audion receivers used in non-oscillating mode, one built by the chief operator E.M. Sargent and one built by the author originally for use at his own amateur station before the war. One receiver covered 600 to 10,000 meters, the other 200 to 1,500, but both worked equally well at 600 meters, long the busiest place of the radio landscape. Their antenna was 400 feet long, suspended 45 feet high over poor sandy ground near the ocean in West San Francisco, with the station on the second floor of their building.
A quick break for identification purposes. You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio.
Not to be outdone by the Navy and its active and visible appeal to amateurs, the Army called for aviators and balloon pilots for the Signal Officers Reserve Corps of the Army, offering a commission as a second lieutenant, a salary of $2,000 per year, $35,000 in 2013 dollars, and a bonus when called to active service. Returning to print in July, the old man wrote, "Rotten Resonance." The scene was another club meeting with the regular antagonists, Final and Radical. Final, short for Final Authority, was a blowhard know-it-all, and Radical was a smallish, level-headed, normally reserved voice of reason whose raison d'etre was to ask probing but leading questions, all to get a rise out of Final. As usual, Radical had worked Final into a frenzy, this time leading him to believe that one of the other members had been testing his transmitter in violation of the close-down order. Radical led Final through the usual series of questions, ending with the fact that the experimenter was using a phantom antenna, the early term for a dummy load. This was evidently TOM's way of postulating that amateurs could continue to experiment with transmitters even though we were off the air. The matching, more serious editorial that month also called for experimenting with phantom aerials to improve transmitting efficiency. All of this appeared to be a trial balloon of sorts as hams probed the boundaries of their shutdown order. Perhaps having seen the old man's article, or having read the July editorial, or maybe Maxim, probably the author of both, had sent him a copy, Lieutenant Commander Reed Falwell, U.S. Navy, wrote a letter to Tuska making it quite clear that the operating ban encompassed all radiotelegraphic experiments, and strongly implied, although he did not explicitly state, that that included the use of equipment with a phantom antenna. In his mid-July letter, which appeared in the September QST as the lead article, he attempted to define the boundaries more precisely, saying that there was no ban on the use of components, inductors, capacitors, and other parts for non-radio uses such as in medical equipment. nor was there a ban on radio frequency oscillations per se. But there could be no radiotelegraphic experiments at all, and all the experiments usually performed by amateurs must cease. He suggested that this would be a good time for amateurs to learn American Morse, since all good operators should know both codes. At the bottom of the page under a separator bar is the note. This explains why Dr. Radio's article on phantom antennas, alluded to in a previous issue, has been withheld. Signed, Editor. That month's editorial reacted with a noticeably irritated tone. The facts are that we must not touch any radio apparatus. All we can do is read radio books and think radio thoughts. Until we become Germanized, we at least have these liberties. The closing and restrictions, while disheartening to amateurs, were just one indication of the strategic and tactical importance of radio to the government and the military. Jonathan Zenneck, a well-known German professor of electronics and widely recognized radio authority, had written a best-selling textbook on radio theory that was regularly advertised in QST. See, for example, the QST February 1916 inside cover advertisement. In July, he was arrested and interned at Ellis Island on suspicion of helping German spies in the United States receive communications via high-powered stations in Germany, such as the well-known one in Nauen. His arrest seemed to have been ordered in part because he was German and a well-known radio expert. There were as yet no reports of actual spying by him. However, Zenneck was also a captain of Marines in the German Army and was assigned to a coastal station in Sayville on Long Island, New York, owned and operated by Atlantic Communications Company, itself owned by Telefunken of Germany. The U.S. Navy had taken over the station in 1915 to enforce what was then United States neutrality in the conflict. As the country entered the war, Zenneck and his station were both put under the control of the Navy and the Secret Service. In response, the old man wrote, "Something rotten somewhere," meaning out in Sayville, speculating that Zenneck's arrest must have been based on something concrete. A New Jersey amateur had recorded transmissions from Sayville and worked with the Secret Service to build a case against the station before the Navy took over. Tom wondered, could it have been Zenneck who sent information to Germany about our first troop shipments? He also wondered about something appearing in the press about superimposed oscillatory circuits, some sort of encoding that made transmissions undetectable without the proper information to extract them. Could this be a new solution to the QRM problem? And then, magnanimously, he suggested that after we make up again with old Z, let's ask him into the ARRL. He's probably okay. His trouble is with his Kaiser. TOM argued that if only the Navy would let the stay-at-home amateurs use their receivers, they could help locate such enemy transmissions. Not surprisingly, a September editorial agreed, saying that secret operating by the enemy was possible using any number of clandestine antennas, and that amateurs with receiving capability could be of great use in discovering them, if only they were not prohibited from doing so. Aside from the government itself, the general public worried about the possibility of wireless technology posing a security threat and read about closings and seizures of equipment in the press. This led to unfortunate, unwarranted actions being taken against some amateurs. In one instance, James A. Nassau, 3CT of Philadelphia, was investigated by special officers of the local police and the U.S. Secret Service because someone in the neighborhood, knowing he had been an amateur, reported suspicious noises coming from his house. Late one evening, investigators who were not at all familiar with wireless, one in fact admitting that he had never before seen a wireless, asked whether he could receive on his setup and about how far it could send. His setup being a simple hand key and a buzzer that he had been using for code practice sessions with some friends. The rest of his equipment had long since been packed away in boxes. Other September editorials lamented the coming of fall and its yearly promise of lower static, prime season for radio in normal times. But for the closings, amateurs would have been gearing up right about then. The QST editorial, another season opens, but talked about all the marvelous things hams would be doing now that September had arrived, and each one ended with but. And yet, this optimistic passage appeared most likely written by Maxim. It probably will be many months, and we expect to see at least another September come and go, which will be not much different. 'Tis a sad, sad tale. But like most sad tales, it is not without a big ray of hope. This hope is that the present conditions cannot go on forever, and that the spirit of amateur wireless is just as much alive in these dead days as it ever was. Whether the law closes up our stations or even takes away our apparatus, whether we ourselves are scattered to the four winds of heaven, whether we are in the army in France or in the navy on the tossing sea, we are still amateur wireless bugs, and nothing will ever change us. Dead Septembers may come and go, and the years may change us from the springy youth to sober age, but the call of the spark will still be in our hearts, and the desire to have and use the little old set up in the attic or down in the cellar will still be the one great yearning. We will always be amateur wireless bugs, come what may. That's right, isn't it, fellas? Equally upbeat, the editors predicted a new kind of game once amateurs were again permitted to operate, and 1,000 or more new operators trained by the Navy would return and become active. You will be big guns when you come home after the war. You will be the ones who will run things. This may be the first use in QST of the term big gun for a prominent station and operator. September QST's cover drawing depicted a submarine at sea flying an improbable multi-wire aerial, unintentional as metaphor, but apropos as hams left their silent submerged stations behind to cross the ocean and serve as signalmen. Nowhere in this issue is there any indication that it would be the last QST for the next 19 long months.
A quick break for identification purposes. You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
Included in this material are quotes from the following: The Old Man, Rotten, QST, June 1917, page 7. Help Keep QST Going, editorial, QST, June 1917, page 20. Wanted by Uncle Sam, 2,000 amateur wireless operators, QST, July 1917, page 3. What the Naval Reserve Office offers men of the ARRL, QST, August 1917, page 3. Personal mention of members in service, QST, July 1917, page 5. Baltimore Radio Association, What It Has Done Since Closing Orders, QST, July 1917, page 24. Looking Forward, no link to this page in the archive, QST, August 1917, page 2. Crowdus, James, West Joins East, ARL Members Volunteer, Radio Communications by the Amateurs, QST, August 1917, page 23. Falwell, Reed, Concerning Phantom Antennas, QST, September 1917, page 2. More Stringent Than Supposed, editorial, QST, September 1917, page 15. Zennick, Jonathan, Wireless Telegraphy, German, 1908, English translation, McGraw-Hill, New York, 1915. The Activities of Alien Enemies, The Wireless Age, Volume 4, Number 12, September 1917, page 790. Navy Takes Over Sayville Radio, The New York Times, July 9, 1915, page 1. The Old Man, Something Rotten, Somewhere, QST, September 1917, page 7. Rotten All Right, editorial, QST, September 1917, page 17. Enemy Wireless, Radio Communications by the Amateurs, QST, September 1917, page 18. Another Season Opens, But, editorials, QST, September 1917, page 16. With appreciation to Chris Cadella, W2PA, for the use of his website materials, Ham Radio History, A Century of Amateur Radio, Ham's Organizations, Events, Inventions, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. One of the oldest global aspects of our hobby, other than actually using the radio, is the QSL Bureau. It uses a postcard-like system to confirm that two stations made contact, sent via the postal service as a so-called QSL card. Of course, that only works if you have each other's address, which after World War II was somewhat difficult. As a result, the QSL Bureau was born. Intended as a single point of contact for a country, a local QSL Bureau consists of one or more volunteers, paid staff or contractors, who act as the distribution point for incoming and outgoing QSL cards. If you and I agree to confirm our contact via the Bureau, my QSL card to you would be sent to the VK outgoing QSL Bureau, which would hold my card until there were sufficient outgoing cards from all over Australia to your country to package them all up and send them to the incoming QSL Bureau in your country. Your QSL Bureau would then wait until there were enough QSL cards for your region to send it on, where it would eventually get into your hands in a variety of ways, via the postal service, through your local club, or at a local hamfest where the QSL Bureau might have a stall. Your QSL card to me would make a similar reverse journey. This process could take weeks or sometimes years. Although not fast, this worked for many decades, but once electronic communications and computers started appearing, combined with increased costs associated with privatized international postal services, the wheels started coming off. Getting access to historic documents has proven challenging. I can tell you that over the years, the IARU, the International Amateur Radio Union, has coordinated and controlled how the QSL bureaus should work. For example, a resolution adopted in 1985 and updated in 2009, quote, strongly encouraged, end quote, its member societies to accept incoming QSL cards for all amateurs in their country, regardless of affiliation. It also instructed QSL bureaus to only send cards to the official QSL bureau if there was more than one. Several years ago, the IARU Administrative Council recognized several trends, among them the environmental impact of unwanted cards generated in bulk by computer logging software, lower levels of adoption, and ultimately the closing of some smaller QSL bureaus after being overwhelmed by undeliverable cards from increasingly popular holiday de-expeditions. In September 2018, the IARU adopted Resolution 18-1 that stated that it, quote, resolves that member societies are encouraged to continue to offer QSL Bureau service in their countries, exchanging cards with bureaus of other member societies, for as long as doing so is economically justifiable, and further resolves that amateurs are encouraged to adopt confirmation practices, including but not limited to using electronic confirmation systems, that reduce the volume of unwanted and undeliverable QSL cards being introduced into the Bureau system." End quote. This resolution took effect on New Year's Day 2019. I'll also note that the IARU has its own Year 2000 issue, having been in existence for nearly a century. Its resolutions are named after the last two digits of the year, followed by a sequential number. So Resolution 25-1 could refer to 1925 or 2025. But I digress. The Internet has introduced several confirmation processes. The most vocal of these is Logbook of the World, or LOTW. I'm not a fan and haven't been for some time. I'll get into why in a moment. Other contenders are eqsl.cc, qsl.net, qrz.com, clublog.org, and others that have yet to steal the limelight. If I've forgotten the one you run, let me know. Saying that I'm not a fan of LOTW is understating it. Recent ARRL ransomware payments aside, why do I need to legally prove beyond a reasonable doubt that I made contact with some random amateur? Why does this need to be authenticated, signed with a time-limited certificate, and verified with 100 points of identity? And why do we continue to roll out new and interesting procedures for what is essentially a postcard, saying that on this day, time, and frequency we made contact using this mode for the purposes of, wait for it, our hobby? The EQSL website has an interesting statement. Quote, "One of the problems with an email-based system is that there is no security inherent in that mechanism. anyone can purport to be Papa 5 Alpha Bravo Charlie, and you'll have a difficult time verifying it." End quote. So what? And what made you think that the postcard ending up in your letterbox was guaranteed to be from Papa 5 Alpha Bravo Charlie? If you're going to the effort of pretending to be Papa 5 Alpha Bravo Charlie, what harm does that do in the scheme of things? For that matter, how do you know that the station you talked to on air was actually Papa 5 Alpha Bravo Charlie? I ask because I've spoken to an amateur who recently did some HF direction finding during several popular DXpedition pileups. They discovered that there were several stations purporting to be the DXpedition that were not. So, right now, we're in a situation where many, if not all amateurs, are connected to the internet. Most will have an email address. You already know mine, cq@vk6flab.com. If we made contact on air, send me an email. If what you wrote matches my logs, I'll send you a reply to confirm it. How do you get the address? One possible approach is to create an online email database, where you could submit the email address associated with your call sign, and you could look up a station to contact them. Another is for member societies to offer email addresses. The ARRL and the WIA already offer this service to current members. I'll also point out that one of the reasons that the QSL Bureau was instigated in the first place was because some addresses for amateurs were not available. If you make contact today and you want to send them an email confirmation, the question to ask is simple. Hey, what's your email address? Will that cover everyone? Nope, neither does the current system. What it achieves is that my personal private identifying information isn't stored at the ARRL if I'm not a member. Besides, in my opinion, a list of email addresses combined with call signs is hardly something worth getting excited about. Unless, of course, it's used by manufacturers to send out product announcements and discount codes. We should be so lucky. If you have a better idea, you know how to get in touch. What I can say is that this is the ultimate decentralized QSL system, not unlike the contact you made on HF. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima Alpha Bravo.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
Hello and welcome to the DX Corner for your weekly dose of DX. I'm Bill, AJ8B. I received an email from Savo, K2SAV. Savo asked, "You've mentioned the following terms in your recent shows. Can you explain them in further detail?" Sure, Savo. The first is holiday style. Holiday style is an operating mode where the DX station is on at their leisure. They're also doing family activities, sightseeing, etc. So instead of trying to operate 16 hours a day, it may be more like 4 or 6 hours and at different times depending on other activities. The second term is busted calls. Busted calls are call signs that are not entered into the DX log correctly or maybe even never completely received. In my case, I've had several stations enter AJ8 Delta in the log instead of AJ8B, or they could not copy the whole call. They might enter J8B or AJ8. So in any case, it's not the right call and therefore considered a busted call. The final term is an all-time new one, or an ATNO. This is an entity that you have never confirmed on any mode or band. For me, the ATNO that was always chasing me down was Vietnam. I worked Vietnam in the 90s, but I got a QSL card back saying not in log. And then I worked them again and I couldn't confirm it. So that was the one that kept getting away until last year. So I finally got them in the log. But that was an ATNO for me, an all-time new one. I hope that helps. If you have a question, please send me an email at thedxmentor@gmail.com. Often people will ask me if there is a written copy of the information that I present here. There are so many call signs, dates, and URLs being discussed, you could never remember them until such time as you could write them down. I use most of the same data that you hear in the DX Corner for the weekly DX column in the Ohio Section Journal. If you just Google ARRL Ohio Section, You will find the Ohio section website, and you can subscribe to the weekly journal and get most of this information. The actual website is arrl-ohio.org. This is a free journal, and you don't need to be an ARL member to receive it. You won't get the well-rounded information that you get from the This Week in Amateur Radio podcast, but you will get this DX information. So here's what's happening in the world of DX. This section of DX News comes from Bernie, W3UR, editor of the Daily DX, the Weekly DX, and the How's DX column in QST. If you would like a free 2-week trial of the Daily DX, your only source of real-time DX information, just drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com. Here's a summary of the recent C-22 Mike DXpedition to Nauru. Quote, our DXpedition is now QRT. Over 75,000 QSOs are in the log from 160 meters to 6 meters. It was a rather wild adventure for all of us, and it seems that Murphy was with us all the time. We had to check our antennas and guy lines daily and had to repair them often. Last but not least, we had to move our high band beam to slightly lower position. However, a large team is in good spirit and we are quite satisfied with the results. As always, we learn new things which will be used for further DXpeditions. Remember that 99.9% of all of our QSOs from Nauru have a minimum distance of 4,000 kilometers. Europe and most of the U.S. is more than 10,000 kilometers away. We have good transmit antennas for the low bands, but our receive situation was quite challenging. High atmospheric noise levels as well as some man-made noise heavily affected receiver performance. Nearly every night we tried to improve the low band receiving situation, but it was difficult to eliminate the S9 plus noise. The high bands performed generally quite well, but we're still waiting for good 10-meter openings to Europe. Our final challenge was the CQ Worldwide DX single sideband contest as a multi-2, and we think we did pretty well. Many thanks for all the serious, friendly, and constructive comments. The upcoming C5 operation to the Gambia is on schedule for November 25 to the 29th. They plan to operate as C5I from Bajoli Island and C5 Tango from mainland the Gambia. They plan to operate from grid locations IK23 and IK33, which are semi-rare and rare respectively. The 3Y0 Kilo Bouvet and Peter I 2026 team are still working on the vessel and helicopter contracts, and they are in the final stage for signing those contracts. Quote, we are sorting out the last-minute deals, and we are still looking for some more operators for Bouvet and Peter I team. Funding of these two DXpeditions also heavily depends on us getting a full team of operators on board that contribute with their participation fee. Should you wish to join our team, please contact us at admin@3y0.no, or you can contact the dxmentor@gmail.com and I'll pass it along. Quote, we estimate to stay around the island for 3 weeks, and the total duration should be about 38 days to Bouvet and a little bit less to Peter I. We do have all the helicopter and landing permits to go onshore Bouvet and Peter I with a full-scale operation. Planning these two DXpeditions is very time-consuming where the logistics must be coordinated with other expeditions, and that is why it takes time to sign these contracts. Our plans are to use the same vessel for both DXpeditions. First, the vessel and crew will take us to Bouvet, where we will do landing with a helicopter. Then our equipment will later be shipped to South America and stored there before we return 1 year later to go to Peter I Island. That departure is scheduled for January of 2027. Our plans are to go onshore at Peter I with 2 helicopters the first week of February 2027. This way of running the DXpeditions is a huge advantage for the number 7 most wanted DXpedition to Peter I Island. Thank you for your patience, 73s, the Bouvet and Peter I team. Our friend Krish, W4VKU, is headed back to VU4, the Andaman Islands, in late November into mid-December. He is hopeful to avoid the noise he encountered in January of this year during the VU4 November DXpedition. Activity will be on sideband and FT8. Equipment is about the same as the last trip. I may change the antenna plan slightly, he said. End quote. You can hear about Krish's trip to VU4 November last January by checking out episode 31 of the DX Mentor YouTube channel or podcast, and you can also hear about the bootleggers that he had to deal with. Another very good friend of ours, Tom, NR8Z, will be operating VP5/NR8Z in the Turks and Caicos Islands from November 3rd through November 12th. He plans to operate holiday-style 40 through 6 meters sideband and CW. Tom will QSL via LOTW. Tom's a terrific operator, and try to get him in the log. He's a great guy. Our team has been working tirelessly to prepare for the upcoming DXpedition to Namibia as V55LA. We are pleased to share that the flight tickets are confirmed, our QTH in Namibia is secured, and some of us are updating our vaccinations to ensure a safe journey. We're also proud to unveil our brand new V55LA logo, beautifully designed by our longtime friend Miguel, EA5 Zulu Delta. Stay tuned for more updates as we continue to finalize our preparations. We are departing on October 30th, returning on November 11th. During this period, the V55LA team will be active on all HF bands, including CW, sideband, and digital modes, with a particular focus on the low bands. Our team consists of experienced operators skilled in, quote, human modes, so you can expect to hear plenty of activity on both CW and sideband throughout the DXpedition where it is needed by most of you. Our goal is to make contact with as many operators as possible, so Digi will be run too, of course, and we'll be doing our utmost to make this a memorable and enjoyable DXpedition for everyone. A group of operators will be operating VK9CV from Cocos Keeling Island November 1st to the 15th. They should be QRV by the time you're listening to this. Activity will be on sideband CW, RTTY, digital modes, and PSK on 1.8 through 50 megahertz, as well as the satellite. So good luck, guys. So here's an update from the ARRL. ARRL DXCC processing resumes. The ARRL posted an update on its website on October 23rd about DXCC processing as follows, quote, "The ARRL DXCC system has been returned to service and our staff is again processing applications for credit toward DXCC awards. The queue includes nearly 3,000 award applications submitted via Logbook of the World accounts and mailed paper applications. We are processing the backlog as quickly as possible and will provide additional progress updates. For now, the online DXCC application will remain offline. Any new award applications we receive will experience significant delays as we work backlog. As previously reported, LOTW was returned to service on Monday, July 1st, 2024. Since then, the system has been processing log uploads with little or no processing delay at all. We are grateful for your continued patience and understanding as we continue to make progress on the few remaining services that have required additional attention to bring back online." End quote. The ARRL will continue to keep the amateur radio community updated. Polish DXpeditioners SP9FIH Janusz and SP6 CIK Lezak are QRV from Nosy Be Island, Madagascar, where they will operate as 5 Radio 8 Whiskey Echo and 5 Radio 8 Charlie India, respectively, until November 6th. Activity will be on CW, sideband, and FT8, including Super Fox on 40 through 10. They will have an ICOM 7300, along with 2 Expert 1.3K FA amplifiers. Their plans are to emphasize activity on 12 and 10 meters. If you are someone who likes podcasts and or YouTube episodes, the DX Mentor has a new segment for you to review. It's the recap of the DXpedition to 9 Mike 1 Zulu, Malaysia, which dropped last weekend. There will be a hint about plans for a DXpedition to the Spratly Islands. And the Spratly Islands caught my attention because in my 50 years of DXing, I think they've been activated once. So I'm looking forward to that. Until next week, this is Bill, AJ8B, saying 7-3, and thanks to my ex-pal Karen for her love and support. I hope to see you in the pile-ups.
We pause for stations along the network to identify. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, available as a stream to your favorite digital device on Spotify, TuneIn.com, Overcast, iHeartMedia, and wherever you download your podcasts.
Bruce Page, KK5DO, is here now with this week's AMSAT report. Bruce?
Thanks, John. The AMSAT Symposium was very informative this past weekend. Some of the highlights are the 50th anniversary of AO7. There are very few satellites that can claim that achievement. CubeSat Sim version 2.0 will be released shortly. It has gone through beta testing and is ready to go. If you are a teacher or instructor, you can request one of the demo units for your classroom. They are very popular. Drop an email to info@amsat.org. SO-121 is going to be re-entering the atmosphere soon. Gulf T development is progressing. It will fly with deployable solar panels, an ADIX, which stands for Attitude Determination and Control System. The first mission of ADIX is to ensure that the solar panels are pointed to the sun. Secondary to this will be to point the antennas to Earth, which is called nadir pointing. There will be cameras and Earth sensors on the same plane as the antennas, thus allowing pictures of Earth and data from the sensors without having to point the satellite in a different direction. AMSAT is committed to making ready more FM satellites to be available for short notice launch opportunities. This is Bruce Page, KK5DO. Back to you, John.
And thanks, Bruce, for that report.
It is time for this week's solar weather and propagation forecast, brought to us each week by our solar prognosticator Tad Cook, K7RA, in Seattle, Washington. Solar activity increased this week. Average daily sunspot numbers went from 127.7 to 197.4, and average solar flux moved upward from 170.5 to 240.2. So looking at the predicted solar flux for the near term, it will be 265 and 260 on November 3rd and 4th, 250 on November 5th through the 7th, 214, 195 and 182 on November 8th through the 10th, and 172, 168, 174 and 165 on November 11th through the 14th. Looking now at the predicted planetary A index for the near term, it will be 15 and 10 on November 3rd and 4th. And it will hold steady at or near 5 on November 5th through the 15th.
In radio sport this week, many great contests. November 1st, the NCCC FT Sprint, that's digital. Also on November 1st, the weekly RIDI test, that's digital. November 1st as well, the NCCC Sprint, CW. On November 1st, the Silent Key Memorial Contest, that is CW. On November 2nd, the IPARC Contest, CW. On November 2nd through the 4th, it's the ARRL November Sweepstakes, that's CW. And on November 3rd, the IPARC Contest, that's single sideband phone. And remember to visit the ARRL contest calendar for more events and information. Upcoming section, state, and division conventions on November 2nd, it's the Wisconsin Aries Races Conference 2024, sponsoring the ARRL Wisconsin State Convention, Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin. November 2nd and 3rd, the Stone Mountain Ham Fest, sponsoring the ARRL Georgia State Convention, that's in Lawrenceville, Georgia. December 13th and 14th, it's the Tampa Bay Ham Fest, sponsoring the ARRL West Central Florida Section Convention, that's in Plant City, Florida. And on January 4th, the Ham Radio University, sponsoring the ARRL New York City Long Island Section Convention. That's in Brookville, New York.
The Nashua Area Radio Society in New Hampshire will be holding an online ham boot camp on Saturday, November the 9th, 2024, from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. The Ham Boot Camp program includes a series of demonstrations and tutorials designed to help new, inactive, and prospective hams gain the skills and information needed to get on the air. It is open to any interested ham or prospective ham in the United States and Canada, and there is no charge to attend. Ham Boot Camp activities are provided online via a series of sessions geared toward technician class licensees, prospective hams, general class licensees, and higher. Bootcamp participants will find all of the material interesting and fun, no matter what their focus or license level is. The online bootcamp program is available to all licensed and prospective hams. For questions or additional information, contact bootcamp@n1fd.org.
Several special event stations will help celebrate Veterans Day just around the corner. On November 11th, 2024, the annual American Legion Post 275 Amateur Radio Club, N3TAL, will operate a special event station to commemorate Veterans Day. The station will operate from 1800 Zulu to 2100 Zulu on 7.275 megahertz, plus or minus LSB. To receive a QSL card after working W3TAL, please send a self-addressed envelope to American Legion Post 275, Amateur Radio Club, 8201 Martin Luther King Jr. Highway, Glenarden, Maryland, 20706. And the American Legion Amateur Radio Club KA4TAL, Horry Post 111 in Conway, South Carolina, will operate a special event station in honor of Veterans Day. The station will operate from 1500 Zulu to 2000 Zero on 14255, 7.264, and 14.275, and also on 71.85 megahertz. For a special e-certificate, email Henry Chinney, he's president, at TALARC at KA4TAL at gmail.com. And Veterans Day 2024 will be celebrated from the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia. The New River Valley Amateur Radio Club will operate special event station W2B from 1500 to 2000 Zulu on 1400-275 megahertz. To receive a QSL card there, contact Danny Windlam at gmail.com.
Halloween just passed this week, which means ARRL Sweepstakes is knocking at the door. No tricks, though, said a double RL contest program manager Paul Bork, N1SFE. If the band conditions are as good as they were this last weekend, we're in for a real treat. The CW weekend of a double RL sweepstakes is November 2nd and 3rd. A double RL sweepstakes is the oldest domestic contest, beginning in 1930, with competition at the individual, multi-operator, and school club levels. In this contest, multipliers are the 85 A double RL and radio amateurs of Canada sections. Each may be worked once in the contest, regardless of band. The exchange is daunting for contest first-timers, but familiar to those who have operated it before. Contacts may be made on 160, 80, 40, 20, 15, and 10 meters, but because multipliers may only be worked once, activity tends to cluster on the bands that are open and populated. ARRL Sweepstakes Phone Weekend will be November 16th through the 18th. You can see the full rules and additional information at www.arrl.org/sweepstakes.
Halloween came a little early this year in Independence, Kansas, and that's thanks to amateur radio. On Saturday, October 17th, 2024, the Newalla Festival, that's Halloween spelled backwards, by the way, got underway. The Newalla Festival is an annual event held during the last week of October, and it started in 1919 as an effort to provide activities for local kids in place of the typical Halloween pranks that occurred in the community. At first, the events were just parades in the morning, afternoon, and night on October 31st. The Great Depression and World War II interrupted the Newalla celebration, but in 1958, 4 businessmen revived the Newalla theme and brought it back as a 3-day celebration. During the celebration, the City of Independence grows from a town of around 10,000 inhabitants to 75,000 in the final days of the now 9-day event. Having the radio club volunteers at critical points of traffic and their ability to communicate situations to my team was incredibly helpful, said Jason Kassler from Eagle Security, who directed the volunteer hands. Newalla was impacted for the better because of the radio club volunteers and their skills. Thank you to all radio club volunteers. And you can visit and read more about the Newalla Festival website for more information.
The ARRL Handbook is your complete guide to wireless technology, experimentation, practice, and development, capturing the state of radio science and technology in one authoritative work for nearly 100 years. John Ross, KD8IDJ, has more.
Use its more than 1,200 pages of amateur radio know-how to delve into radio electronics, circuit design, digital modulation and techniques, and equipment construction. The 101st edition proudly introduces a new editor, Gregory D. Lapin, Ph.D., P.E., and 9GL. Greg and his team of subject matter experts in the community bring a fresh perspective and new outlook on the future of amateur radio. They have revised entire chapters on radio fundamentals, transmission lines, general safety, assembling a station, and more. Major updates to Handbook 101 include information on electromagnetic analysis and inexpensive tools for modeling circuits, antennas, and propagation. New material on higher-level modeling of transmitters and receivers. A new section on preparing your station for emergency operation. Radio astronomy receiver and antenna design information, plus many more interesting topics. Handbook 101 comes with a bonus ebook download. The download contains a wealth of online content and includes the fully searchable digital edition of the printed book, plus expanded and supplemental content, software, PC board templates, and other support files. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
Whether you're an experienced ham or new to the hobby, you'll find information you can use in the ARRL Handbook. Like handbook editor Gregory Lapin, N9GL, said about the first handbook he owned, that edition was half the size of the current handbook, and I was never able to read it from cover to cover. I have had many editions since then, and have never read every word in it until this year. Regardless, it has always been one of the great references on my bookshelf. I refer to it often. I hope you enjoy the 101st edition and gain lots of knowledge to help our hobby continue moving forward into the next century and beyond.
You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at www.twiar.net.
The 2025 ARRL Foundation Scholarship Program will begin accepting applications on October 30th, 2024. Applications will be accepted through January 6th, 2025. More than 100 scholarships ranging from $500 to $25,000 will be awarded. All applicants must be active FCC-licensed amateur radio operators. Information, along with the link to the online application, can be found on ARRL's website, www.arrl.org/scholarship-program.
Hams in Brazil are celebrating the 125th anniversary of the first wireless transmission of the human voice. The inventor scientist was a Catholic priest. Listen throughout the month of November for PR5LM on the air. The L and M represent the name of Padre Landel de Mora, an ordained priest and inventor fascinated with the concept of transmitting the human voice and later images wirelessly. According to the 425DX Bulletin, before his death in 1928, Padre de Mora had successfully transmitted both music and voice on the electromagnetic spectrum, a feat celebrated throughout Brazil since his accomplishment in 1899. The declaration of National Amateur Radio Day in Brazil on November 5th honors his work, as well as the 1924 government decree that established regulation of amateur radio stations in Brazil. By then, the priest had already been granted a U.S. patent while he was in New York City in 1904 for what was known as a wave transmitted. It used a form of modulation that we know today as amplitude modulation. Amateurs in Brazil will be active on all HF bands using CW, SSB, RIDI, and FT8, and hope to make contacts as well via the QO100 satellite. They hope each contact will pay tribute to the man who successfully navigated that delicate territory balancing religion and science.
Anchor Peterson was devoted to DX listening, shortwave radio, and to others who loved them too. Shortly after his death in Denmark, was reported in late October, hams, shortwave listeners, and other friends flocked to social media to share their memories of the man they recalled with fondness and respect. The radio enthusiast played a significant role in the Danish Shortwave Club International, which he served for a time as chairman. He was also editor of the Domestic Broadcast Survey and Tropical Bands Monitor. Anchor's voice could be heard as one of the presenters on the club's international shortwave news and music program called The DX Window. The club disbanded in 2016. Anchor was remembered as having founded the European DX Council in June of 1967. The club's membership eventually grew to include DX clubs and listeners in Asia and elsewhere in the Pacific region.
For the past 17 years, Tata VU2 DSI has celebrated the pride of wireless communication in India. Born on the 30th of November, 1858, Jagadish Chandra Bose was a scientist who gained global respect for his work in botany, physics, and electromagnetism. He melded the many worlds of science in different ways to bring various discoveries to light. According to Britannica, his experiments in the 1890s with very short radio waves would eventually contribute insights for later researchers working in the realm of solid-state physics. He is perhaps best known among India's amateurs as the father of wireless communication. His discoveries were made with homebrew equipment. The scientist, who died in 1937, has touched the heart and imagination of Data, who is once again calling CQ as AU2 JCB to honor him. This year, he will be putting the special event call sign on the air from November 15th to December 16th. For more details, see the QRZ page for AU2 JCB.
As eastern India prepared to be battered by Cyclone Dana on the night of October 23rd, amateur radio operators were getting in place to ensure lines of communications stayed open in the states of Odisha and western Bengal. Relief workers were deployed and 1.5 million people were evacuated and moved out of harm's way. The West Bengal Radio Club quickly established 2 amateur radio mobile stations at the request of the district magistrate. The hams also set up 3 base radio operations at governmental offices, powered by backup battery power in case the weather took out information infrastructure. With its arrival, the cyclone brought winds of 100 to 110 kilometers per hour, or 62 to 68 miles per hour, snagging power lines and uprooting trees. Airports and schools were shut down. The cyclone's wind gusts were estimated to reach as high as 120 kilometers per hour or 75 miles per hour before weakening. Early reports in Odisha indicate that there was no loss of life. Unfortunately, 1 reported person was killed in Bengal.
It is time for this week's edition of AMSAT Satellite Shorts from all over. And we begin this week on board the space station, where we find Crew 8 members, NASA astronauts Matthew Dominic, KC0TOR, Michael Barrett, KD5MIJ, Jeanette Epps, KF5QNU, and Roscosmos cosmonaut Alexander Grebenkin, RZ3DSE, who all woke up late on October 21st, having shifted their sleep schedules in anticipation of Monday's departure from the International Space Station. However, they spent the rest of the day continuing their daily exercise routines and standard housekeeping tasks aboard the orbiting lab. NASA and SpaceX officials delayed the undocking until late Wednesday, October 23rd, due to unfavorable weather conditions near the multiple splashdown zones off the coast of Florida. Splashdown was early Friday, October 25th. During routine medical assessments on the recovery ship, an additional evaluation of the crew members was requested out of an abundance of caution. 1 crew member remained hospitalized Friday evening. And while we are talking about the ISS, NASA will use SpaceX Crew Dragon for its 2 crew rotation missions to the International Space Station in 2025 as it continues to evaluate if it will require Boeing to perform another test flight of its Starliner spacecraft. In an October 15th statement, NASA said it will use Crew Dragon for both the Crew 10 mission to the ISS, scheduled for no earlier than February 2025, and the Crew 11 mission, scheduled for no earlier than July. Crew 10 will fly NASA astronauts Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, along with astronaut Takuya Onishi from the Japanese space agency JAXA and Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov. NASA has not yet announced the crew for the Crew 11 mission. And our final short for this week, FunCube, or AO73, is now in autonomous mode, meaning high-powered telemetry when in daylight, and transponder when the satellite is in eclipse. Controllers are watching the effect on its 11-year-old batteries. If the batteries suffer badly, they will revert to eclipse mode.
The latest version of FreeDV includes a new digital voice-over HF mode titled Radio Audio Encoder, or RAID. Previous updates had abbreviated the mode as RADAE. The new mode has been in development since early this year and is now entering a phase of real-time over-the-air testing. This September FreeDV update includes recorded samples of the mode from over-the-air tests. The samples include QSOs ranging from 800 to 13,000 kilometers and 2 to 5 dB signal-to-noise ratio. One new user says to this ham's ear, the voice quality from the provided examples sound far superior to any previously released FreeDV HF digital voice modes. The RAID encoder takes vocoder features such as pitch, short-term spectrum, and voicing, and generates a sequence of analog PSK symbols. These are placed on OFDM carriers and sent over the HF radio channel. The system is trained to minimize the distortion of the vocoder features over HF channels.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
NASA's highly anticipated Europa Clipper mission officially launched on Monday, October 14, 2024, embarking on a journey to explore Jupiter's moon, Europa. The spacecraft lifted off at 12:06 p.m. Eastern Time aboard a SpaceX Falcon Heavy rocket from Pad 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The launch, described by NASA commentator Daryl Nail as unveiling the mysteries of an enormous ocean lurking beneath the icy crust of Jupiter's moon Europa, marks the beginning of an ambitious astrobiology mission. The Falcon Heavy's 27 first-stage Merlin engines roared to life as the rocket ascended, with the two side boosters detaching about 3 minutes into flight. Separation of the second stage occurred shortly afterward, and Europa Clipper was deployed on its interplanetary trajectory nearly an hour later. Mission Control successfully established communication with the probe, confirming that the spacecraft's solar arrays had deployed as planned, signaling a smooth start to its mission. Monday's launch faced a slight delay due to Hurricane Milton, which made landfall on Florida's Gulf Coast last week, forcing NASA to close Kennedy Space Center temporarily. Originally scheduled for October 10th, the launch was pushed back while teams secured Europa Clipper inside a SpaceX hangar near Pad 39A. This marked the 11th Falcon Heavy launch and only the second time the rocket has been used for an interplanetary mission. The Europa Clipper mission has faced a long and complex path to the launch pad. Initially, NASA intended to launch the probe using its Space Launch System, a powerful moon rocket still in development in the mid-2010s. However, repeated delays in the SLS program, along with NASA's commitment to using the early SLS vehicles for its Artemis moon missions, forced the agency to opt for a more commercial alternative. A 2021 budget proposal allowed NASA to choose SpaceX Falcon Heavy, though the shift meant the mission's journey to Jupiter would take nearly 6 years instead of 3. At the heart of the mission is Europa, a moon thought to harbor a vast subsurface ocean beneath its icy crust. Europa has long intrigued scientists as one of the best places in the solar system to search for signs of life. However, NASA emphasizes that Europa Clipper's mission is not to find life directly, but to assess the moon's habitability. The spacecraft, carrying a suite of 9 science instruments, will study the composition of Europa's ocean, investigate its icy shell, and look for any signs of recent activity. After a journey of nearly 6 years, Europa Clipper is expected to enter orbit around Jupiter in April 2030, where it will begin an extended series of flybys of Europa. Over the course of its mission, the probe will make close passes to the moon, gathering data that could inform future missions, including a potential lander. The mission is set to conclude in 2034, with NASA planning to crash Europa Clipper into Jupiter's moon Ganymede to avoid contaminating Europa's pristine environment.
At its meeting prior to the 2024 AMSAT Space Symposium and annual general meeting, the AMSAT Board of Directors elected their officers for 2024 through 2025. They are Robert Bankston, KE4AL, President; Paul Stotzer, N8HM, Executive Vice President; Jerry Buxton, N0JY, Vice President, Engineering; Drew Glassbrenner, KO4MA, Vice President, Operations; Alan Johnston, KU2Y, Vice President, Educational Relations; Frank Karnauskas, N1UW, Vice President, Development; Steve Belter, N9IP, Treasurer; Douglas Tabor, N6UA, Secretary. Newly elected first alternate director Douglas Tabor, N6UA, has replaced Jeff Davis, KE9V, who stepped down prior to the meeting as AMSAT's secretary. The AMSAT Board of Directors expresses its appreciation to Jeff for his work during his tenure as secretary. The position of Vice President of User Services remains vacant.
News of yet another issue aboard Voyager 1 that threatens its ability to communicate with Earth. According to NASA, the current problem began on October 16th when controllers sent a command to turn on one of the spacecraft's heaters. Voyager 1, nearly a light day distance from Earth, failed to respond as expected 46 hours later. After some searching, controllers picked up the spacecraft's X-band downlink signal, but at a much lower power than expected. This indicated that the spacecraft had gone into fault protection mode, likely in response to the command to turn on the heater. A day later, Voyager 1 stopped communicating altogether, suggesting that further fault protection trips disabled the powerful X-band transmitter and switched to the lower-powered S-band downlink. This was potentially mission-ending. The S-band downlink had last been used in 1981 when the probe was still well within the confines of the solar system, and the fear was that the deep space network would not be able to find the weak signal. But find it they did, and on October 22nd they sent a command to confirm S-band communications. At this point, controllers can still receive engineering data and command the craft, but it remains to be seen what can be done to restore full communications. They haven't tried to turn the X-band transmitter back on yet, wisely preferring to further evaluate what caused the fault protection error that kicked this whole thing off before committing to a step like that. Following Voyager news these days feels a bit morbid, like a death watch on an aging celebrity. Here's hoping that the story turns out to have a happy ending, and that we can push the inevitable off for another few years.
The U.S. Air Force Military Auxiliary Radio System will be marking its 76th year with a special event from the 5th through the 11th of November. The celebration of Air Force Mars and its 76 years on the air is opened to licensed amateurs in all 3 U.S. classes. Operators will be using CW, SSB, and digital modes on 80 through 6 meters in the parts of the bands assigned to general and technician class licensees. Operations are identified by 10 geographic regions called communications wings. There will also be operators on the air from the Pentagon Mars Station in Washington, D.C., Schriever Space Force Base in Colorado, Hancock Field Air National Guard in New York, and Travis Air Force Base Mars Station in California. The Air Force Mars system was created to assist the U.S. military and civilian government with communications when needed.
And wrapping up our news this week, instead of being constrained by the physical reality that limits the sun to its daily cycle, imagine a future where the sun can be turned on and off like a flashlight. This is the future that Reflect Orbital imagines is possible. The startup is developing satellites that would deploy large mirrors to precisely reflect sunlight onto specific points on the ground. Rings of satellites in the sun-synchronous orbit would follow the terminator, or the line that separates night and day, providing additional sunlight before dawn and after dusk. According to Reflect's 2 co-founders, CEO Ben Nowak and CTO Tristan Semilak, this extra sunlight could increase the amount of solar power delivered to the electricity grid. Instead of building more solar farms, the pair thinks we can simply increase the amount of power generated at the ones that already exist. The pair say they are still playing with the final configuration for its production-scale vehicles, like the exact size of the reflective array or the final number of satellites that will make up the constellation. But they are starting small, and the first orbital mission will fly a subscale prototype with a reflector that's 10 by 10 meters. Many of the debunking videos cite the 10 by 10 figure, which is too small to reflect an economically meaningful amount of sunlight on the ground. A news article from earlier this year also said that the constellation will be just 57 satellites. But Semilak said these figures are inaccurate. 57 satellites ringing Earth will guarantee a half hour of service twice per day, once in the morning and once in the evening, the minimum to achieve the plans to extend the day. The pair also say that the 10 by 10 meters is just a starting point. Full-scale production vehicles will deploy arrays that are much larger, around 50 by 50 meters or bigger, with the planned constellation growing to thousands to tens of thousands of satellites. The 10 by 10 is our demonstration that will be brighter than a full moon, roughly 400 times less bright than the sun at noon, Nowak explained over email. Our production service is targeting 1/5 noon sunlight brightness and will use 100s or thousands of larger vehicles focused at one spot. A 50 by 50 satellite is actually on the small end. But even given these additional details, the satellites would still need to be capable of maintaining highly precise control over their mirrors on orbit, and do this across many thousands of satellites. It will be a huge challenge.
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77@gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon.
This Week in Amateur Radio is heard all around the world on the amateur bands, and on great repeater systems like the KB3 CNN Gateway FM Association repeater, on 146.730 MHz every Tuesday evening at 7:30 p.m., covering the wide area of western Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. If your repeater system carries This Week in Amateur Radio, let us know via email, and we will mention your station in an upcoming edition. Send your information to w2xbs77@gmail.com.
Many of the news and information items heard in this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the Shortwave Listening Post, the Federal Communications Commission, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the International Telecommunications Union, the 425DX News, Parks on the Air, and the Soda Reflector, and various news sources on the Internet.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you'd like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and our news team around the world, this is Chris Perrine, KB2FAF, wishing you a 73.